Week 160, ladies and gentlemen. So 160 weeks. And in case you're new here, this 160 weeks since the beginning of COVID, which was March 2020, where I started really seeing the importance of weekly reporting in a world where people were doing a lot of year over year type comparisons. And as the market and everything changes, it becomes very difficult to kind of continue down that path without looking at actual weekly information. So 160 weeks ago is when this all started going down, and it's, I think, been very important for people to understand. So where are we right now? So if you look at the actual numbers in our in the blog, which I really encourage you guys to be going to thespringteam.ca/blog, where really I expand more on this stuff. You can see that there's actually increased listing activity this week. So if you're a buyer, you're probably seeing some more options available to you. But I'm also guessing that if you're a buyer, you're not seeing too many deals available to you, or you're not seeing too many opportunities for you to sleep on it and make a decision, because things are moving relatively quickly out there, as they pretty much have been for the past decade here, despite some ups and downs. But I mean, once again, this is just further proof of the natural ebbs and flows of real estate as a reaction to what's happening in the world with, all of our smart investor clients, and myself included, and people that just kind of seem to generally have a more optimistic view of economies and future and cities and things like that. They've been consistently buying over the past couple of years, even though there was uncertainty about what might be happening in the short term. Again, this is further proof that, what goes, I guess, down must come back up eventually. And, we're in a different environment right now where, in February of 2022, March of 2022, when things were at their absolute peak, rates were also incredibly cheap. So money was practically free at that time. So to expect the same prices of February 2022 today is probably not realistic. However, there are some cases where today's sales are meeting some of those February, March numbers. But in general, what is most similar is not necessarily that previous high price, but the activity and the competition. So, we're involved in an offer presentation today on a property in Withrow Park area, North Riverdale. It's a complete gut job. You can sort of live in it because it's got a number of different units in it. And one of them is actually nice enough that you can live in it while the rest gets renovated. But again, this house that is essentially a full gut job top to bottom is, it's 11 a.m. and we've got one offer registered on it already. And much like the one I talked about a few weeks ago, it could not even be lived in, and it ended up with 9 offers selling for well over $2 million. So activity at that price point that we haven't seen over the past few months seems to be coming back. There seems to be a lot more comfort in those big prices for the urban communities of Toronto that were once really just reserved for Rosedale properties and things like that. So the North Riverdale area is a beast unto its own. It doesn't really respond to the typical market conditions, where North Riverdale seems to be one of the more consistent, much like Leaside, seems to be one of the more consistent communities that have not too many fluctuations in price. But, back in February, I remember there was this one semi-detached house in that area that sold for $3 million. And I have no idea what is going on there. So, but aside from a few anomalies like that, prices there have been very consistent. But in most of the communities that our clients are buying in, the bottom of the market is behind us. Can things slow down again? For sure. And I believe that slowdown is going to be this summer. I think that, for the past 3 summers, we've had a serious lull. And that lull happens mainly because, not necessarily because of some sort of economic trigger. There could literally be no bad news on the horizon, but it's just buyers go through months of competing and being beat out on offers and just not getting what they want and being super frustrated. So buyers tend to just pull back and just kind of enjoy the summer, do their thing. So the one predictable thing for the past few years anyway has been the summer lull that kind of hits after June into July sometimes. So if you're a seller, I'd really consider getting your ducks in a row to get to market now, because I'm not sure what the summer holds. It could be just fine. And obviously, it will be long term, but this summer is going to be, I think, a pretty slow one because things are heating up now earlier than people expected. Remember, there was no trigger to all of this other than a more certain interest rate environment going forward. So we had people not buying because they were certain that rates were going to continue to rise. But no matter what anybody said or whatever, that certainty was there. And it's very hard to wrap your head around another possibility where things might slow down or even come down because they've just been rising so quickly. So buyers just essentially stopped buying. Condo sales were affected massively at that time as people were terrified to get into the market. And that's really the space that people have been waiting for to get into the market. But that's a huge thing that people seem to have a hard time wrapping their heads around. Like when you're in a more positive market like this, when buyer sentiment is up there and things are kind of happening and buyers are buying, sellers are selling, and everybody's kind of happy, it's easy to apply the mindset of today to a down market and say, oh yeah, once prices come down, I'm for sure going to buy. But the headspace that you're in when you're in an economy that is trending downward is not the same when it's on the way up. So you are paralyzed in that whole decision-making process. So despite the fact that a lot of people said they were going to wait for prices to take a big hit, well, they did. And they still didn't buy because there was no certainty of where that bottom was. We've got a client that we've been working with the team. One of the agents on the team has been working with this couple for 2 years. They've seen all kinds of different markets, and their biggest concern is that they don't want to make a bad decision. But when you actually ask them like what they think a bad decision is, it's, well, we buy a property today and then everything falls off a cliff tomorrow and we lose our jobs and we can't afford it. I mean, listen, if there's any danger of you losing your job, then you should probably really reconsider making a purchase right now, or at least making sure you don't max out on it and leaving a buffer if you have savings or whatever. But living in that paralysis mode with all this information coming at you from different places, like these people are taking advice from absolutely everybody that will give it, and really putting a lot of weight on the advice given from people that really shouldn't be doing it. They're sort of sabotaging the future success of these people. And now it's been 2 years, and now they're in a position where they have to make some sort of move because their space isn't big enough. As their family grows, they're going to have to go into a rental right now and probably watch another market, a market swing. So, in those moments where things seem the scariest is actually when you should be making some purchasing decisions if your finances can handle it. But a lot of people who are not experienced investors have a difficult time with that because, you're going out for drinks with some friends and you tell people you've just made a purchase. All these people have all these different opinions coming from who knows where. They're going to make you feel pretty badly about that decision. So it's that influence that I'm having a really hard time combating with some people where, I'm in a position to benefit from you saying, yeah, I want to make that purchase. And I totally get that. But at the same time, like, I'm not here to sell you a property and move on. Like, I'm trying to build long-term relationships with people here. So, once people get over the idea that, I'm just trying to sell them something so I can make a commission, and open up their minds to the possibilities that are available and going through specific information and data to make sure we're making a super smart decision, I mean, that's really what it's all about. And the clients that get that get all of my attention, they get all of our team members' attention, and they make really smart decisions. So anyway, so if you're a buyer right now, you definitely have to be super prepared. Make sure you've locked in that mortgage approval to make sure your rate is protected should there be an increase at the April announcement. But honestly, because we talked about this last week, like what happened in the States with these regional banks kind of imploding, with the Credit Suisse situation and all that stuff, a lot of people have been driven to the bond market, which essentially put some downward pressure on fixed rates and affected the economy a little bit, which means the Fed in the US just increased by a small 25 basis points at their last announcement versus what they were going to do, which would have been up to 0.75 basis points. So a dramatically lower increase, which essentially meant that we in Canada, because generally we kind of follow suit with what the US does, we in Canada we're probably going to hold the rates in April. Some people are even talking about a drop in rates at that time. I really don't see that happening, but I certainly think that a rate hold in April is a very, very reasonable expectation. Beyond that, perhaps another hold. I did believe that we weren't done with increases yet, but we really have to wait and see what inflation is all about. And we talked about this last week again, where the inflation numbers appear to be down month over month. However, the general cost of running your home is still more expensive. Food's more expensive, housing is more expensive, but some energy costs are down, and there's some childcare subsidies that were imposed in Alberta which reduced childcare costs dramatically, which affected that whole CPI number too. So overall, inflation is not as rosy as we talked about last week as you might think, but it's also not in the opposite direction where there's like a huge problem. I think supply chains are reestablished. I think a lot of things are getting less expensive. I think that there will be some downward pressure on inflation as we head into the next few months, but we'll see exactly how that plays out because there's a lot of other things happening. You know, Russia and Ukraine is still happening. So that could change the economy at any given time, depending on what kind of madness happens over there. So there's still a lot of uncertainty in the world. You know, Taiwan, we haven't talked about them in a long time, where the US and China could get into a bit of a conflict over certain territories in Taiwan, which could further affect supply chains with those semiconductor producing areas that essentially produce like almost 100% of all the chips required to run what we're using here right now and cars and things like that. So hopefully those things don't become a major issue, which could affect prices here on various consumer goods. But things we're watching, right? I mean, this is what's one of the important things is one of the benefits of being a globally aware agent here in Toronto, especially in a global city like Toronto, where you have interest from all over the place, is understanding what's happening in these places and how they could affect us here, which kind of gives me a clearer crystal ball. And like I've said many, many times, I think one of the laziest things an agent can say is, I don't have a crystal ball. Well, true, nobody does. But when you study the world and what's happening globally, the crystal ball, in the short term anyway, becomes a little bit clearer. Like I'm not sure what's going to happen with prices next month or the month after that or whatever, but I can tell you that 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years from now, you're going to be ahead no matter when you've purchased. So that's really what we're focused on, kind of removing that day trader mentality from your heads and focusing more on the lifestyle decision you're making. If it's a home, or what that investment is for and how long term is it. If it's an investment you're looking at, what does the cash flow look like? Can you make any improvements to help bridge that gap between what it would cost to service the debt on the property and what income it's generating? Like so many little variables that can help you make really smart decisions right now that go beyond, I think the market's going to crash. Because that's just not a reasonable expectation right now, considering what's happening out there, because we've already seen a major adjustment because of all the uncertainty and the massive rate hikes that have already happened. So to say that, it happened in 2008, the same thing's happening now, no. That's somebody that doesn't understand what's going on in the economy. It's not the same thing. It's not as bad as 2008. And we've seen some fairly quiet, not much noise from that whole part of the world since all the banking stuff happened a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, I'm going to keep this week's a little bit short. Long story short, if you are a seller, you need to get to market ASAP because after June, things are probably going to be a little bit iffy. But again, it might not. So let's keep in touch with me, keep an eye on things, make sure we're watching inventory levels. Like I said, we had a supply increase this week for both houses and condos, pretty much across the board. More supply I've seen added than in a long time. So, but again, 1 week does not tell the full story, but 2 or 3 weeks combined certainly does, which is why this weekly reporting is so important. So I will let you know if this happens again next week, then we might see that swing to that summer lull a little bit quicker. If some of that listing inventory gets absorbed this week, which I think it will, then I stand by what I originally said. So these are the things I'm keeping an eye on. I haven't heard much about unemployment lately. Our unemployment rate is still relatively stable. No, there's some layoffs still happening across all industries, mainly in tech, big companies, small companies, whatever. But there's also a ton of hiring happening now. So there's some good balance there. So I'm not seeing anything to be alarmed about. But as a buyer, like I said, competition is not going to get any easier for you now and in the next couple of months. So pull the trigger today because you're going to be in this game for a couple of months. And let's not let properties go over 5, 10, 20 grand. That stuff, we're just, it's mortgage money we're talking about here, and it's actual money in the seller's pocket. So that's a whole other post altogether. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in week 161 next week. Have a good one.